Okay. So in the last session, we discussed about the private access modifiers here. Now you can see whenever we are trying to access this particular stack, what happening internally. So in the same class, we can access this information like s1.stck. S1 is a object of this particular stack, and I'm trying to access this particular variable. But what happening internally, whenever I'm trying to access the same information outside of this particular class, we are getting an error. It's because of that the private access modifiers we are going to use in the same class here. Okay, whatever the private information we are using here, this is applicable within the same class. Okay, so this is we need to understand carefully. Now we'll try to discuss about the one of the another important concept to call static here. So as of now, what we did basically, if I want to access any method information, so for example, here I'm having push method, and again I'm having here pop method. So if I want to access these two methods here, so if I want to access these two methods, what I'm doing here I'm trying to create an object. So S1 is a object of this particular stack, and using this particular stack object, I'm trying to call the push method. Along with the push method, I'm trying to call this particular pop method. Okay, so using this static here, what we'll understand here, now we'll try to create like without creating this object, we are able to call this particular method, and directly we are able to access the variable information here. Okay, so this is very important information we are going to discuss in the today's session. So now observe carefully how we are going to access the method without creating this object information. Now what I am doing here, along with this particular method, I am going to access the variable as well. I'm going to access the variable as well here. Okay, so this is we discussed in the morning, so it's getting an error. I commented. Now I'm going to create a one class, something like use static. Okay, use static basically what it will do. This particular class, it will try to provide the static behavior. Okay, now understand carefully. Now understand carefully what I'm doing here. So I'm trying to provide the static here. Okay, so anyway, now understand carefully. One second. Okay, so back to here, the use static class. So basically, this particular use static class, what is doing internally, I'm trying to create a one keyword called static. So this is the first time we are discussing static keyword here. Now, what happens to this particular static keyword here? So observe carefully, static int a, I'm trying to initialize the value as a 3. Okay, so one more variable I'm trying to define here. So the same behavior I'm adding here into b, static into b. So first variable I'm trying to initialize here. So what is the data type we are using? Into data type. And so what is the name of the variable we are declaring here? So something like a and b. So here just I'm trying to declare the b variable, and this particular a I'm trying to, along with the declaration, I'm using the initialization here. Okay, so now I'm initializing a value as a 3. Okay, this is important. And the same way, so observe carefully, I'm using same behavior static here, and now I'm trying to define the same method. So whatever the method we used here, so now in the morning example, something like in the recursion related example, what I did here, I use the same behavior here. Okay, but I did not explain this how it is working internally. Now observe carefully, the same method we are using, something like math method is expecting int x here. Okay, is expecting one parameter, that is I'm trying to pass as a int x here. Okay, after this, now what I will do, I'm not going to do any other operation. So just I will print this values here. So whatever the values we are having, I'm going to print here. Okay, now observe x value. Here I'm going to print this particular x value, and later a and b values I'm going to print. Okay, so this is we need to understand here. And now I'm trying to print this particular A, X value as well as B value. These are all the three values I'm printing. But here, what is the name of the method what we are doing is, so I am trying to take as a the mathematic related method, but I'm not doing any mathematic operations with, just I'm trying to print this information. Okay, so along with this, I'm trying to define the one more information that we'll call it as a static block here. Get in the pen. This is static block, and this section we'll call it as a static method, and this section we'll call it as a static variables. Get in the pen. These three are the very important information. Now you can see on top of the method level, sorry, on top of the variable level, I'm trying to declare the static behavior, like I'm trying to add the static keyword here. And so for this particular method level, I'm defining the static, and the same way I'm trying to define the static block. So what exactly this static block will do? And now you can see I'm trying to initialize the B value. So you can see the B value how I'm trying to initialize. So this is the way of initializing the B value. And here I'm trying to multiply with the A value. Whatever the result we are going to get, the result I'm trying to add into this particular B. Okay, so this is important, we need to understand here. Now finally, I'm defining the main method, and if it is not a static object, getting the point, if it is not a static method, this method is a not static. What is the way of creating an object here? So this is the way we'll create here, something like use static, something like us is equals to new use static. Okay, this is the constructor will call, and using us dot the method will call, and will provide the some values here. Getting the point. This is important here. But here what we are doing is we are not defining with without static is, so we are using static behavior. Whenever we are trying to use this particular static behavior, what happens internally? What happens internally? So this is the way of using this particular static here. Okay, so now directly we can call this particular method. Directly we can call the method, and we can pass the values here. And if you're not in the same class, basically now we are in the same class, so we can add directly method information. But if, for example, if you're outside of this particular class, how we are going to call? So this is the important information. User, so use static dot met method. Okay, so this is the way of calling the method. Here now you can see here we are not creating any object. Here we are not creating any object. So directly we are able to call this particular method here. Something like the name of the method we are passing, and the method is expecting one parameter. So if I'm going to run this example, if I'm going to run this example, observe carefully. X value we are getting as a 45, A value we are getting as a 3, and B value we are getting as a 12. Okay, but here how we are getting this B value? Because what we are doing here, inside this particular static block, I'm trying to multiply with the A value, and whatever the result I'm getting, I'm trying to initializing into this. But now what we need here, I'm going to print this statement here. So when this particular statement is printing here, something like static block here. Get in the pen. So the static block I'm trying to use. Now again I'm going to run this particular same example here. So observe carefully. So now you can see this example static block. Now you can see this particular example static block. First it is trying to execute the static block. Even though you are able to call this particular method, the highest priority, get in the pen, the highest priority is moving into this particular static block. Once this particular static block is completed, now it is trying to execute this particular method here. Okay, so this is very important here. Along with this particular method, if you want to access the variable, so what is the way of accessing it? For example, here I'm going to provide A. Directly, we can access this particular A value, and we can access this particular B value. Okay, so now you can see the same example I'm trying to run. So A value 3 we are getting and B value 12 we are getting. But this section we are doing inside the main method. For example, the main section, if I'm going to delete from this location, and if I'm going to provide inside this particular recursive something. Okay. Now you can observe carefully if I'm trying to add this information here. I'm trying to remove this, and here also I'm going to remove. So if we observe carefully, so we are not able to access A comma B value. So why we are not able to access A? Getting the point. Because we are inside the same class, directly we can access the information. So without providing the class name. So now if I want to access this, what is the way of accessing it? Use static. What is the use static basically here? It is a name of the class. Getting the point. It is a name of the class. So using the name of the class, what I'm doing is I'm trying to access the static variable here. Getting the point. I'm trying to access this particular static variable here. So this is very important. We need to understand here. Getting the point. This is okay. So this is important here. The basically this is the another way of basically without creating an object, we are trying to call this particular method. So here the object is not going to store any location because this is the another way of the calling the method information I'm explaining. Because for earlier what we did here, we create an object and we call the methods. Okay, this object is going to store in the heap memory. But right now we are not creating any information. So where is this? Here we are not creating, just we are calling the method. But how we are calling? With help of this particular name of the class, we are calling the math method here. Getting the point. So this is important. Here we are not creating any object information here. So without creating an object, we are trying to call the methods. Okay. So this is the another way of calling the method. So either we can call the method with the help of object creation, and if you're not interested to call the method with the help of this particular object, now what we can do directly, getting the point, directly you can call with the help of this particular class name here. Okay. So here it will not communicate with the memory here. So this section, to reduce the memory only, we are going to use this particular static here. Getting the point. For this particular method, it will not going to use any memory allocation. But this information, like for this particular variable information, it is going to use the class level memory. Like basically, it is a common here. Name of this particular class, again we are trying to store this particular a value. This is the common. Every time whenever you're trying to use static.a, this value it's going to use multiple location. Wherever you're trying to refer this information, we are going to access the same value. If I am trying to modify this, so for example, what I'm doing is I'm trying to initialize the a value 3. I'm trying to initializing this particular a value 3. And here what I will do, in the main location, after calling this, so I will try to initialize the value. After calling this section, I will try to initialize something like 45. Okay, now what I will do, I will run this example one more time. Now you can see how these values are will print here. Okay, so we are getting the different examples as well. Let me comment out this. Now you can see what happening internally. Oh, sorry. Again, I give the same value here. Sorry. I want to modify to this some different value. Now you can see, so X value, what happening internally? 45 we are getting. So why we are getting the 45? It's because of whatever we are passing here. Getting the point. The method parameter, wherever what is the value we are passing, the same value it is trying to store into this particular A here. Sorry. Yeah, the X value 45 we are getting, a value we are getting as a 3. So why a value we are getting as a 3? Because initially what is the value we provided? Something like 3. And later, now with the help of this particular use static dot a. So use static is the name of the class, a is a variable name, and we are initializing this. So the value 78. Now whenever I'm trying to print this particular use static dot a, I'm getting the 78 here. So now what you understand here, whatever the value we initialized with the earlier 3, so now it is override with this particular 78 here. Okay, this is very important information we need to understand. Getting the pen. So this is very important, the method and variable and static blocks we are discussing here. Now what we need to understand basically, okay, so observe carefully. Now what we need to understand here, whenever I'm trying to use this particular variable, inside the heap memory, we have a one another memory allocation here. So for example, if it is this particular heap memory, now inside this particular heap memory, we have a perm Okay, observe carefully what I'm trying to explain here, this static behavior. Now here, what are all the example we discuss here? We'll go to the same user static here. We try to define this particular static behavior as a variable, and the same static behavior we implemented for this particular method, and we are trying to define this particular static block here. Okay, now if we are using within the same class, so it's not required to go for the name of the class here. But what happens in the real-time scenarios here, we are going to use, getting the point, we are not going to use within the same class. We are going to use in the different locations here. So whenever we are trying to use in the different location, how we are going to access information with the help of this particular name of the class. Okay, the variable, whenever you are trying to initialize this particular variable, so inside the heap memory we have another memory allocation that is called permanent generation. So there the values are going to store here, and these values are going to reusable, getting the point, because we are going to access the values with the help of this particular class name here. Okay, that I'm trying to explain here. Now you can understand, if this is the heap memory, inside the heap memory one more memory allocation we are having, this is, we'll call it as a permgen. Okay, inside this particular permgen we are going to store this particular a and b values here, and the a value initially we are having 3, and the b value we are going to multiply with the help of this particular a, and later this value I'm trying to update with the help of this particular use static dot a value. So where I'm trying to implement this information inside this particular recursion, you can see I'm calling the method. So whenever we are trying to call this particular method, what happens internally? First it will execute this particular block. And once it is executed, now it will move on to this particular method information. So later, what we are doing is, we are trying to modifying the a value. Now initially we are having a value as a 3. Now it is modified to this particular 78. Later we are trying to print this particular values here. Okay, these values we are trying to print here. So this is very important information. We need to understand here how this particular static information is working here. Okay, so any questions here? Any questions regarding this particular static here?
సార్ స్టాటిక్ మెథడ్ అంటే ఏంటి సార్? మీనింగ్ ఏంటి సార్ అది?
See, స్టాటిక్ మెథడ్ మీనింగ్ బేసిక్ గా, ఇఫ్ అంటే ఇక్కడ ఐడెంటిఫై చేయాల్సింది ఏంటంటే, సో ఇది ఒక మెథడ్ ఉంది, వాయిడ్ మెథడ్ ఈజ్ ఎక్స్పెక్టింగ్ 1 పారామీటర్. ఇక్కడ ఈ మెథడ్ ఏం చేస్తుంది? సో బేసికలీ మెథడ్ అనేది మన డిఫరెంట్ పర్పస్ కోసం రాసుకుంటాం. ఇక్కడ ఈ మెథడ్ జస్ట్ ఈజ్ డూయింగ్ మ్యాథమెటిక్ అండ్ అర్థమెటిక్ ఆపరేషన్స్ ఇక్కడ. ఓకే, అండ్ ఈ మెథడ్ ఏంటంటే ఆబ్జెక్ట్ ఉంటేనే ఈ మెథడ్ కాల్ అవుతుంది. సో వితౌట్ ద ఆబ్జెక్ట్ దిస్ మెథడ్ వీ కెనాట్ కాల్ హియర్. సో దట్స్ వై వీ క్రియేటెడ్ ఆబ్జెక్ట్. అండ్ ఇక్కడ చూస్తే సిబిఆర్ డాట్ మెత్. ఓకే, సో CBR is a object here, call by reference here. So CBR dot method we are passing a, and this method is going to execute here. And same ఇక్కడ చూస్తే నేను ఇక్కడ ఏం ఆబ్జెక్ట్ క్రియేట్ చేయలేదు. సో అదే సేమ్ మెథడ్ యూజ్ చేస్తున్నాను ఇక్కడ. అండ్ ఇక్కడ ఒక పారామీటర్ వీఆర్ పాసింగ్ ఏ, లైక్ ఇంటీజర్ పారామీటర్ వీఆర్ ప్రొవైడ్ చేస్తున్నాం ఇక్కడ. అండ్ ఈ మెథడ్ ని ఎలా కాల్ చేస్తున్నామంటే, సో ఇక్కడ చూస్తే యూజ్ స్టాటిక్ అనేది ఒక క్లాస్ డాట్ మెథడ్ నేమ్ ప్రొవైడ్ చేస్తున్నాను. ఇక్కడ నేను ఆబ్జెక్ట్ క్రియేట్ చేయట్లేదు. సో ఇదే డిఫరెన్సెస్. ఓకే, స్టాటిక్ యాడ్ చేసామంటే క్లాస్ నేమ్తోనే ఏదైతే క్లాస్ ఇక్కడ ఉందో, అంటే మెథడ్ ఎక్కడైతే డిఫైన్ చేసామో, ఇప్పుడు ఏంటంటే సేమ్ మెథడ్ నేను డిఫైన్ చేస్తాను ఇన్సైడ్ దిస్ పర్టికులర్ క్లాస్. ఈ క్లాస్లో ఈ మెథడ్ని డిఫైన్ చేశాను. ఓకే, ఇప్పుడు ఈ మెథడ్ని కాల్ చేయాలంటే బేసిక్గా నేను ఏం చేస్తున్నాను, ఈ క్లాస్ నేమ్తో ఈ మెథడ్ని కాల్ చేస్తున్నాను. సో ఇక్కడ ఇదే చేస్తున్నాను. సో యూజర్ స్టాటిక్ అనేది బేసిక్గా నేమ్ ఆఫ్ ద క్లాస్ అండ్ డాట్ ఐఎమ్ ట్రైంగ్ టు ప్రొవైడ్ దిస్ పర్టికులర్ మెథడ్. ఓకే, సో డిఫరెన్స్ అర్థమైందా? సో ప్రీవియస్గా సేమ్ మెథడ్ వాడాము, కానీ ఆబ్జెక్ట్ క్రియేట్ చేసాం ఆ మెథడ్కి. ఈ మెథడ్ని కాల్ చేయాలంటే, లైన్ నెంబర్ 20లో ఉన్న మెథడ్ని కాల్ చేయాలంటే ఇక్కడ ఆబ్జెక్ట్ క్రియేట్ చేశాను. ఆబ్జెక్ట్ క్రియేట్ చేసిన తర్వాతనే నేను ఈ మెథడ్ని కాల్ చేశాను. బట్ ఇక్కడ ఏం చేస్తున్నాను, నేను ఇక్కడ ఆబ్జెక్ట్ ఏం క్రియేట్ చేయట్లేదు. సో ఇక్కడ ఏం ఆబ్జెక్ట్ క్రియేట్ చేయట్లేదు. ఆబ్జెక్ట్ క్రియేట్ చేయడం ఎలా, న్యూ ఆపరేటర్ యూజ్ చేసుకొని ఆబ్జెక్ట్ క్రియేట్ చేయాలి. కానీ ఇక్కడ మనం ఏ న్యూ ఆపరేటర్ మనం యూజ్ చేయట్లేదు. సో డైరెక్ట్లీ ఈ నేమ్తోనే, అదే ఏదైతే క్లాస్ నేమ్ ఉందో ఆ క్లాస్ నేమ్తోని డైరెక్ట్లీ వీఆర్ కాలింగ్ దిస్ పర్టికులర్ మెథడ్ హియర్. ఓకే, సో అర్థమైందా?
ఎస్ సార్.
ఇంకేమైనా క్వశ్చన్సా?
స్టాటిక్ మెథడ్లో ఇఫ్ కండిషన్స్ కానీ యూజ్ చేసుకోవచ్చా సార్? మీరు ఇప్పుడు ఫర్ కండిషన్స్ యూజ్ చేసుకున్నారు సార్.
చేయొచ్చు. సో ఏ కండిషన్స్ పెట్టుకోవచ్చు ఇక్కడ, అదే ప్రాబ్లం కాదు, అదే చెప్తున్నాను. ఈ మెథడ్ ఎప్పుడైతే మనం డిఫైన్ చేస్తామో ఈ మెథడ్ ఏ పర్పస్గా రాసుకుంటున్నాం అన్నది ఇంపార్టెంట్ ఇక్కడ. ఓకే, సో ఇఫ్ యూ సీ దిస్, inside this particular box we have a different method. So volume is doing different operation, square is doing the different operation, and set values is doing different operation. But here these three methods does not have the static behavior. Okay, and here whatever the method we define, this method is having the static behavior. So ఇక్కడ అదే అర్థం చేసుకోవాలి, ఎందుకంటే మెథడ్ స్టాటిక్ బిహేవియర్ కానీ పర్పస్ ఇస్ సేమ్. సో మీరు ఏమైతే లాజిక్ రాయాలనుకుంటున్నారో ఏమన్నా లాజిక్ రాసుకోవచ్చు. అండర్ దిస్ మెథడ్ we can write any logic, but only the difference is here we are not creating any object because we are trying to provide the static behavior. So directly we can access this information using this particular name of the class here. Okay, but now getting the point. So previous example whatever we discuss here, if I want to access this particular method, I need object here. So without an object I am not going to access this particular informations like this particular methods here. Okay, so this is the differences between static and non-static here. Getting the point. Basically this will call it as a common here. So independently these methods are going to use here because here we are not creating any object information. So we can use as a like this is the common for all the like requests. For wherever we want to use this particular information directly, we can call the method with the help of this particular class name here. Okay, for the common purpose we are going to use the static behavior. So now observe the same example. Now what I will do here, I'm going to provide the non-static information. So this is very important, we need to understand here. So let's say these two variable I define as a static here, but this variable I am defining as a non-static here. I am not defining any static behavior. So something now you can see. So C value I am trying to provide as a 45, but the same C value I am trying to print inside this particular static method. So now you can see the C I am trying to print here. Whenever I'm trying to print the C value, we are getting an error here. Getting the point? We are getting an error. So this is very important, we need to understand why we are getting an error. Okay, so whatever the variable we are having right now, I'm trying to access inside the static method. So here we are not able to access the static variable here. So now you can see cannot make a static reference to the non-static field. So what is the static references basically here? The method, whatever the method we define, it is a static references. And here, what is a non-static here? So C, whatever the C variable we define here, this is the non-static. Okay, so this non-static variable we are not going to use inside the static. So same thing, if I'm going to print inside this particular block here, inside this particular block here. Okay, again we are getting same error in the line number 11 and line number 17 because these whatever the C variable we are trying to use in the static behavior we cannot use here. So that is I am trying to provide the information. But observe carefully, I have one more method, something like non-static. Getting the pen? Something like I'm having non-static. So just I'm trying to copy all the values. I'm trying to copy the all the values. So now you can see int x. So observe carefully the differences between static and non-static here. The non-static method, the non-static method, it does not have a static behavior. I am not come up with a static keyboard for this particular method, but this method I'm using static behavior. So if you observe carefully, inside the non-static, like line number 15 to 17, whatever the variable we are trying to use, all the variable we can access happily. So these two are the static variable, and this is the local variable, and this is the instance variable. That we'll call it as a non-static variable. Getting the point? Now, all the variable we are able to access inside this particular non-static here. But the problem only whenever we are trying to define the static variable or static method, so only static behavior only we need to use. If you are trying to use other behavior values, it will not allow. So the simple example, line number 11. So basically it is a non-static variable here. Okay, the non-static variable we are unable to use inside the static method here. So that information we can change directly. So there is no problem here. So a is equals to something like 65. You can modify the value happily. Okay, so the modifying the value, it will allow inside the any static, but only the non-static variable information we are unable to use in the static method, static block. Getting the point? In these two locations, the non-static information we cannot use, but opposite it is working. So inside the non-static method, happily we are using the static variable, and we are using the non-static variable, and we are using the local variable. Okay, so see the differences. This is very important. We need to understand here. The differences will give you the more information. Now you can see I'm defining one static block, and I'm going to define the one more block. So this is, we'll call it as a instance block. Okay, so this will call it as a instance block. Basically, this instance block, it does not contain any name, like how we have the static block name, like we started with the static keyboard. For this particular instance block, we are not going to start with any keyword. So just we'll open the particular braces and we'll close the braces here. Okay, so here you can write anything, like you can initialize this particular B information as well here. So same thing, whatever we are doing here, the same information I'm going to modify here. Yes, I'm going to modify here. But now you can see carefully, because of this particular A and B static field, A and B both are, we are having static variable, but still without any error, we are able to access this information. But the only the problem, whatever the non-static information we are having, so those information we cannot use inside the static here. Getting the point? So this is very important. We need to understand. So when this particular block is going to execute, before creating a, like before calling the constructor, this particular block will execute. So simple example, here I'm trying to define default constructor. Okay, so simply understand here. Here I'm trying to write. So simply I'm trying to write the default constructor, and inside the recursion I'm going to create a object. So why I'm trying to create an object here? This is important here, because this class can contain static information, non-static information. So US is equals to, so here we are having object already we created. Okay, so now what I'm doing is, okay, so carefully observe now what I'm doing here. So either the static method directly we can call, with the help of this particular line number 27, now what we are doing it, but another important information, with the help of this particular object also we can call. So for example, I'm commented the line number 27. So simply I'm trying to call this object information. But now you can see whatever we are having, all the information we are getting. So first one now you can see which one is taking the highest priority. Static block. Static block is taking the highest priority, and later instance block is taking, and later default constructor. So see the hierarchy, how this particular blocks are executing internally, and how this particular the methods and the variables are initializing it. So this is very important, we need to understand. The highest priority is taken by the static block. When this particular static block is going to execute, at the time of loading this particular classes. Okay, at the time of loading this particular class, and this particular block is going to execute, that is called static block. And before calling this particular constructor of this user static, now this particular instance block is going to execute, and later the default constructor. X value 12, A value 3, and B value 12 we are having it. Getting the point. So 78 again A value and B value we are printing. But what is an advantage we are going to get? Basically, so when you are trying to make the method and variable as a static, so no need to go for this particular object creation. Directly you can call this particular behavior. Okay, but this particular behavior is applicable for this particular non-static here. Okay, this behavior is applicable for the non-static. Now you can see whenever I'm trying to run this, this is the non-static method. Let me print information inside this. So here I'm going to provide non-static. So non-static X value, otherwise local X value, and static A value, and static B value, and finally non-static C value. Okay, this information we are printing from this particular method here. So which method we are trying to use? Something like, so what is the name of the method we are using? Non-static here. Okay, so just I'm trying to highlighting so to understand little bit clear. Now you can see, so this is the blocks executing first, and later it is calling the constructor, and here I'm calling non-static. Here I'm calling this particular non-static. So this is the non-static information here. Now you can see local value we are executing 72, and the static A variable we are having 3, and B value 12, and non-static C value we are having 45. Getting the point. And later we are printing these two information from here. So same thing. Now what you can do, you can print. So same thing, what you can do, you can print from this particular static also. Okay, these are all printing from the static, and these are all printing from the non-static. Let me increase a little bit top. So the console is giving static information, non-static information. So this is very important example we are discussing. So if anyone having any questions, so you can ask me. I will try to clear your queries. ఓకే సాయి నీకేమన్నా క్వశ్చన్స్ ఉన్నాయా? Okay, so now we are trying to discuss another important concept to call final. Getting the point. So final where we can use. So final basically I am trying to discuss only one location at a time, and like at this time that is called variable level. So if I'm going to make this particular variable as a final, that is the point. So whatever the variable we are having into C, what I'm doing here, I'm trying to make as a final. So otherwise this will go for this particular A, because A we are trying to modifying in the two locations here. So observe carefully. And here, the line number for what I'm doing here, I'm trying to add a final keyword here. Whenever I'm trying to add this particular final keyword, now you can see the line number 14 we are getting an error. Line number 14 we are getting an error. Now if I'm going to move this particular main method, here inside the main method, the line number 28 we are getting an error. Any idea? So why we are getting an error? So because of this particular final keyword, now we are getting an error here. Okay, so what I'm trying to share this information basically, whenever we are trying to use this final, only one time it will allow the initialization. Getting the point? Only one time it will allow. So for example, here I'm trying to declare the variable. I'm not initializing this. Getting the point? Whenever I'm trying to declare this particular A variable here, so the line number 14 error is resolved, but still here we are getting an error. Now if you read this error, basically what happens internally? So this. Now you can see basically the final variables we cannot declare directly. We can initialize the value. Directly we can initialize the value. So now you can see the blank final field may not have been initialized here. So this is the error we are getting here. Whatever the variable we declare here. So initially we did not just we declared the variable, we did not initialize the value. So this is important, we need to understand. So if you initialize this particular value, for example, I'm going to initialize as a 10. Okay, and now what we are doing here, line number 14, we are trying to modifying the value. We are trying to modifying the value. This modification is not going to allow whenever we are going to make variable as a final. Okay, this is applicable for this particular static variable and non-static variable. Okay, whenever we are trying to use the final, so we can go for the static variable as well as we can go for this particular non-static. But only the information what we need to understand here, only one time the initialization will happen. Whenever you are trying to modify like this, it will give you an error here. Okay, so this is important, we need to understand here. So let's run the simple example. Now you can see whatever the example we run here, the value, initial value only it is printing. It is not updating because we removed the updation logic here. Getting the point? So this is, yes, so it means only one time we can change the value. Basically, whenever we are trying to use this particular at the time of declaring the variable, we are going to initialize the value. So once we initialize the value is not going to change here. If you are trying to change the value, it will give an error here. Okay, so this is, we need to understand the final keyword at variable level. The final keyword we are going to discuss method level. Okay, and the same final keyword we are going to discuss about the class level. So these two topics are pending here. Once we familiar with the inheritance concepts here, we can easily understand how we can go for the final with the method and final with the classes here. Okay, so at this time we can understand only the variable informations here. So any questions? Okay. So now, in the last example, what we did here, whenever we are trying to discuss this particular stack example, here we define the size here, and we define the indexes here, and we come up with a constructor and two methods. Okay. Now what I'm doing here I'm going to provide the length information. Okay, now observe carefully what I'm trying to explain here. Instead of creating this particular size statically, now this particular size I'm going to make dynamically. So how I'm making this particular size as a dynamically, so that we need to understand here. So here what I'm doing is I'm just declaring this particular stack here. Okay, so and this particular stack I'm going to make from here. Here stck is equals to new. NCTCK is equals to new int here. And here I'm not providing the value. I'm trying to provide the name of this particular parameter. So now observe carefully what I'm doing here. So earlier we used this particular line. Earlier we used this particular line to create a size here. But right now what I'm doing here, I'm trying to provide in the constructor. The constructor is expecting one parameter and the parameter I'm going to provide as a size here. Getting the point? Whenever we are trying to create this particular object, I'm going to provide the size. So based on this particular size, we are trying to create the int array, and based on this particular array, we are going to update the values here. Okay, and here what we are doing, we are trying to providing the static value condition. We are making the static value. This static value condition, it will not work. Why it will not work? If the size I'm going to provide as a 20. Okay, if I'm going to provide as a 20, what happens internally? So we are checking the 9 here. But if the condition will satisfy, we are trying to return the message here. Okay, we are trying to return the message, but this is not the expected behavior because we are having multiple spaces. So the size, if you are providing as in 20, it will start with 0 and it will end with 19. But here, when the condition satisfies the 9, we are printing this particular message, but we are not providing the values, like we are not inserting the value into this particular stack here. Okay, so instead of making this particular static value, now what is the best way to make the condition dynamic condition? So stck dot length here. Okay, now So see carefully, instead of making the condition as a static value, now what I'm doing is I'm trying to make this particular condition is also dynamically. Condition is also dynamical. So for example, if you give 200, the size if you give 200, now what is the condition this? It will become 199. The stack here, stck dot length, it will give you the 200. Now I'm making -1. Whenever I'm making this particular -1, it will become 199 here. Okay, up to this, whatever I'm trying to highlight here, this value will return as a 200 because the length will start from 1, the indexes will start from 0. Getting the point? This is, we already discussed in the multiple examples here, but again I'm trying to explain here. This particular length, whenever we are making the condition, it will return 200 because the size we are giving as a 200. And whenever I'm making a -1, now it will become 199. The condition also we are making dynamically. Okay, this is important. For example, if I'm trying to give as a 45, if I'm trying to give as a 45, the condition will go for the 44. Now what you understand here, every time based on this particular size, this condition is going to work. Okay, but earlier what we did here, we provided the 9 value. 9 is a static value. Every time, how many times this method you are going to call, the static condition is not going to modify here. But based on this particular size, this condition is modifying now. Okay, this is important here. And another one, so here we is getting an error because of this. It is a default constructor we called earlier. Right now we don't have a default constructor. We are going to call this particular static, like a dynamic in size parameter. So for example, I'm going to give as a 45. Whenever I'm trying to give as a 45, but what you need to understand here, here there's 10 values. This is again, it is a static value. Whatever the loop we are writing here, the loop internally, it is trying to make the condition 10 value. This is also wrong here. Getting the point? Because the size we given as a 45, the loop is going to repeat only 10. But what happens, the 35, the remaining 35 basically, we are going to provide as a empty values. Getting the point? We are going to provide as a empty value. So this is not the expected behavior. Now what we need here, this particular condition is also we need to modify. This particular condition is also we need to modify. How we can modify this? This is important. We need to understand here. So let's understand the same example. And whenever we are discussing about this particular private variables, these two are the private variables. Getting the point? These two are the private variable. But as we suggested, if we make variable as a private, now what is the other alternative way? We are going to access the information directly with help of the methods here. With help of this particular method, we are going to access here. Getting the point? Okay. So let's run this particular example. And first I will generate the methods here. So using this source, I am going to generate the getters here. Okay. So observe carefully. This method will return the int array, and this particular TVS method is returning int type here. So carefully observe. So this is the two methods we generated here. The two methods we generated here. Basically, these two methods, what is returning internally, it is trying to return first method, it is trying to return int array. The second method, it is trying to return int value. And whatever the variable we declare here. So now you can see the first variable is expecting array type, and the second method is expecting int type. So those values, like whatever the variable we declare, line number 4 and 5, so those values information we are going to access with help of this particular methods here. Okay. So here, instead of making this particular condition, now observe carefully. S1 dot guess stck dot length here. Okay. Now you can see this is the condition we are making again dynamically. Now this particular loop, how many times it will return? This particular loop, how many times it will return here? So we need to understand carefully. S1 is an object. We are calling this particular guest stck. Getting by. This method will return the array type here. Getting the point? It will return this particular array type, and based on that, I'm trying to providing the variable called length. The length will give you the whatever the size we are having. So what is the size I'm providing? 45. And here also I'm going to get 45 here because of this particular length variable. We'll get as a 45 here. Okay. So now what I will do, if I'm going to modify to something like 200, what happens internally? This will return the 200. Getting the pen, this will return 200. So whenever I'm trying to change the size, it is affecting in all the location wherever we are trying to use the same references here. Wherever I'm trying to use, it is referring to the same locations here. Like, so now observe, I'm going to copy the same information into this particular get purpose. Okay, this is important here. Now you can see I'm going to run the same example here. Observe carefully. Somewhere I'm trying to print this particular object here. Okay, so 0 to 88. 88 is nothing but 0 to 44 values we are initializing. Getting the point? 0 to 44 values we are initializing into this particular stack. But earlier, what we did, only we initialize 10 values. If I'm trying to initialize more than 10, we are going to get an error here. But right now, so there is no scope here. Based on this particular size, if we modify, so something, if I'm going to provide as 100, if I'm going to provide as 100, only one location I'm modifying the value, it is affected into the all the locations here. Now you can see 198. Now you can see it started with 0. Now it is ended with 198 here. So how many values we initialize here? 0 to 99 values we initialized here. So any code we modified here, only the size we are modifying here. So other than this particular size, we are not modifying any locations here. So it is happily inserting the values into this particular stack, and happily we are able to load the data from this particular stack here. So now what you understand here, whenever we are going to make this particular size as a dynamically, so here we modify the size as a dynamically, and one condition we made as a dynamic condition, and finally the loop conditions also we made as a dynamic here. Okay, so this is the way of making the dynamic conditions. Okay, in the real-time applications also, we are not going to use 1 2 3 some static value, 100 or 200. These are all the static values. Okay, so this is the way only we are going to update the conditions. This is the way only we are going to update the condition. And here what we need to understand, based on the input, basically the conditions automatically will modify. Getting the point? This is very important example we are discussing. Any questions regarding this particular array related length variable? Basically length, it is a variable here, it is not a method here. Okay, because in upcoming classes we are going to discuss same length, but there we are going to call as a method, not a variable. Okay, so any questions? So we'll see how we can discuss about the nested and inner classes. Basically, this example we already identified, like how we are going to create a nested for loop, and how we are going to create the like nested switch cases, while cases, and do while cases. These are all the different cases we already identified in the previous example here. Okay, so somewhere we already executed something. Yeah, 3D array. Now if you see here, how many for loops we are having here? 3 for loops. Getting the point? This is the outer for loop, and this is the one nested for loop we are defining, and one more nested for loop we are defining. So same way, how we can define the nested classes here. So nested classes is nothing but inside the class we are going to discuss, like we are going to define one more class here. So this section we'll call it as a nested informations here. Okay, so observe carefully how this particular nested classes are going to created and how we are going to access the variable information here. Now I'm going to write the same information, the name of the class I am going to take as a outer. Okay, this is the name of the class I'm trying to take as a outer. So inside this particular outer class, now I'm trying to have the variable into outer underscore x is equals to 100 I'm defining. Getting the pen. So this is the variable I declare here. So once I declare this, I initialize the value also. So this is the name of the variable I am taking as a outer underscore x. That value I'm providing as a 100. Okay. And later, what we need to understand here, I'm going to create a one method. So observe carefully. Outer. The name of the method I'm taking as a outer method. Getting the point. This is the outer method. The what exactly the outer method is doing internally, it's trying to create an object here. So which object is going to create? And now you can see here I'm trying to use the one more keyword. Getting the point. Here I'm trying to use the one more keyword, something like a class. And using this particular class, I'm trying to define one more class here. Getting the point. So you can see here we are having the one class keyword. So we are trying to define the name of the class as a outer, and inside this particular outer, the line number 3 is enable and line number 12 is closed here. So this is the scope of the outer class. But what about this particular inner class? Whatever I'm highlighting here, getting the point, whatever I'm highlighting here, so this is the inner class here. This is the inner class here. Okay, so this is very important, we need to understand. And inside this particular inner class, now what I'm doing here, I'm going to write a display method. I'm going to write display method. So this particular display method will print the outer x value. Outer x value. Okay, this is important here. Now observe carefully. We define the one inner class here. So this is the inner class here. Inside the inner class, I'm having void method. Inside this particular inner class, I'm having one void method. The name of the method we are having as a display. The display method, what is doing internally, it is trying to display this particular outer x value. Where we define this particular outer x, the outer x value I define inside the outer class, not inside the inner class. So for example, here I'm having inner x is equals to, I'm giving 200. Okay, so I will print this particular inner x value. See, we can use whatever the modifier you are interested, but right now we don't have an idea about the what are all the controller modifier we are having right now. So this is a section we'll discuss after the inheritance here. Getting the point. So we'll see how we can provide the information. Basically, we cannot let's see if I'm going to make private. If I'm going to make this particular class as a private, what happens internally? Okay, we'll see this private modifier later, but now observe. First, I'm trying to explaining how this particular inner class behave. Okay, how this particular inner class is going to behave here. So I'm trying to provide the inner x here. Okay, I'm trying to provide this particular inner x. So what happening internally, the display method is trying to print this particular outer x as well as this particular inner x here. Now, so inside this particular outer method, I'm creating inner object here. Okay, I'm trying to create this particular inner object in dot, I'm calling the display method in dot display method. Okay, so this is the way of creating an object. And finally, nested class main. This is the main class I'm defining. Right. Whenever I'm trying to define this particular main class, what happens internally? How we are going to create an object. So right now, only one object we are going to create, something like outer class. So using this particular OU dot, what is the method we are going to call? Something like outer method. Okay. So this outer method internally, what is doing it? Now if I am going to open this particular outer class, I am calling this particular outer method. Outer method internally, it is creating a inner class object, and it is trying to display this particular values here. Okay, it is trying to display this particular values here. So let's see what are all the values we are going to get here. So the first outer x we are getting as a 100, the inner x we are getting as a 200. So observe carefully. Now I'm doing the modification. I'm not going to print this inner x here. I'm going to print this inner x inside this particular outer class. So see carefully, we are getting an error. So why we are getting an error? Any idea? Why the line number 8 we are getting an error here? Okay, so here scope is very important, because where we define this particular variable, the inner x variable we define inside this particular inner class, and the line number 10, the scope is enabled, and the line number 16, it is closed here. Line number 16 is closed. So this is the scope of this particular inner class. Okay, so this is the scope of this particular inner class here. Now, so if I'm trying to access the outside of this particular scope, now I'm trying to access this particular variable outside of this particular scope, we are unable to access here. But what is the best way of accessing it? Now you can see in dot inner x here. So directly we are able to access this particular variable. Now you can see I'm running this particular outer x value, and later I'm trying to run the inner x value. So happily we are able to print this. Why the earlier we are getting an error? Because this is the outside of this particular scope. So whenever we are having outside of this particular scope here, what we will do? We'll try to access with the help of this particular object here. For example, if I'm going to make private here, what happens internally? Okay, so now you can see, if I'm going to access this, if I'm going to run the same example here, now it is printing here. Even though we made as a variable as a private. Whenever the variable we made as a private, what happening internally? We are able to access, because still we are inside the outer scope. So for example, inside this particular outer method, I'm not going to do anything regarding this particular outer method. I'm going to comment out. Okay, I'm going to comment out here. Okay, so simply I will print. I cannot print this also. Okay, so right now the outer method is not going to do anything. Now here only I'm going to create an object. Here only I'm going to create an object. So how I'm trying to create an object, this is important here. Getting the point. This is very important. We need to understand how I'm going to create this particular nested class here. Okay. So with the help of this particular OU, I'm going to create a new object here. OU dot new dot inner I'm going to create. Okay. So here inner in is equals to. So now you can see basically inner class, how it is coming here. Inner class, basically it is trying to use object dot outer. If I'm going to use this, it's trying to import the statement. Okay, this is the path of this particular inner. If I'm not using inner directly, so this is a way of using this particular inner. Otherwise, what we can do, outer dot inner. Okay, outer dot inner. So this import is not required here. Getting the point? So either you can go for this particular outer dot inner, or directly you can use this particular inner, but we need a import statement here. So right now we cannot understand the import statement. We'll see in our upcoming classes how this particular import statement is going to print. Okay, so this is important, we need to understand. But without this particular outer class, we are unable to we are unable to access the inner class information. So same way, what happens here if I'm trying to remove this? If I'm trying to remove this particular object OU dot, what is the OU basically? OU is the outer class object here. Getting the point? OU is our outer class here. So whenever, if I'm not providing this particular outer class references, basically we are not going to create a inner class object. So if we want to create this, now what I'm doing is, again I'm going to use the import statement here. Again, I'm going to use this particular import statement. Even though if I'm trying to use the import statement, what happening here? Now you can read this. Now you can read this error message. You can understand what happening internally. Even though if I'm trying to use this particular import statement here, we are unable to create an object here. What is the best way of creating an object here? We need a outer object here. Getting the pen? We need a outer object here. So without the outer object, we cannot use here. So in dot, what is the method we are having? Display method. Again, I'm trying to call this particular display from outside of this creation. Only outer value it is printing. Why the inner value it is not printing? We commented out. From here, I'm going to print an inner value. In dot. So what is the variable we are having? Something like inner underscore x. Okay, outside of this particular class, we are unable to access the private variable. But even though this variable is a private, still we are able to access inside this particular outer method, because the scope is outside. Because the variable we define inside this particular inner class, even though if it is outside, happily we are able to access inside the method here, outer method. Why? Now we are inside this particular outer class here. Now we are inside the outer class, but the outer class and the inner class we created inside this particular outer class. Because of the creation of the nested classes, the private variable we are accessing here. Okay, the private variable happily we are accessing here. But whenever I'm trying to access outside of this particular outer class, whenever I'm trying to access this particular variable outside of this particular outer class, so this is giving me an error. Okay, so this is very important information we need to understand. And if you're trying to create an object outside, so we need to create an outer object first, and with the help of this particular outer object, we need to create the inner object here. Okay, so this is the way of creating this particular nested objects here. Any questions? Okay, basically what we need to understand here, so the scope is very important here. Whatever the nested class we are creating here, this particular class is going to bounded within this particular class. Okay, whatever the outer class we are creating, the nested class is going to bounded with the enclosing of this particular outer class here. And so as I explained here, we have a nested and inner classes. What is the nested and inner classes? Basically, we are having two types of nested classes. First one is a static, and the second one is a non-static here. Okay, the second one we are discussing here, that we are going to call it as a inner class here. So whatever the inner class we are discussing here, this is the non-static class. Getting the point? This is the non-static class we are discussing here. So how we can discuss about how we can discuss about the static class here. Okay, so how we can discuss about the static classes. This is another important information we are going to discuss here. So carefully observe how I am trying to provide this particular static behavior. So we discuss about the non-static here. Now I am going to provide the static behavior. So here only I am going to provide, this is the outer class, and I am going to provide this particular class cannot have a, we discuss about the non-static field. I am going to make as a static here. Now I'm making static here. So this variable I'm making as a static. Along with this particular variable, I'm going to make one more variable. Outer underscore y, something like 200 I'm going to give. Okay. First variable I'm making as a static, and the second variable I'm making as a non-static. And so one more variable I'm trying to take here. Private static, and into the data type I'm trying to use, and here private outer underscore private here. This value I'm going to give as a 300. So observe carefully how many variables we are declaring here. 3 variables we are declaring. First one is a static, second one is a non-static, third one is a static with the private access. Okay, static with the private access here. So now this particular class I'm making as a static here. This particular class I'm making as a static here. And here what I'm doing here, so inside this particular display method, so this is we already identified. I'm not going to use this particular variable here. So simply I'm going to print outer x and outer y as well as outer private here. Outer private. Okay. So another one, I'm trying to print this outer y. Now you can see the error here. This is very important, we need to understand. So this is just now we discuss about when we are trying to discuss about the static here, this variable is a non-static. Whatever the variable we are defining outer y is a non-static, we are unable to use, like we are unable to access inside the display. Why we are unable to use inside this particular display? Because we are trying to use the inner class as a static class. If I'm not using this particular static here, now you can see the error is resolved here. Because of this particular static behavior, we are unable to use the non-static field. That is we already discussed here. Okay, I'm making here 2 variables here. So how we can create an object of this particular static here? How we can create a object of this particular static? This is important here. Let me create this. Now you can see it is giving me an error. Why it is giving me an error? So this behavior is not going to work, because now whatever the inner class we are creating here, it is a static inner class. So for the static inner class, how we are going to create an object here? We are not going to create an object here. Okay, so directly we are going to create like this here. So observe carefully now how I am trying to create this particular nested class object. So if I want to create this particular nested class object, this is a way of creating this outer dot nested. Okay, outer dot nested. I'm going to modify to this particular section with this, and I'm going to comment out here. And so here I will make this. So carefully observe. So see the differences. Whenever we are trying to use the non-static, like earlier, this inner class, whatever the inner class we define, we did not provide the static behavior. Whenever we are not providing the static behavior, first we created the outer object, and later with the help of this particular outer reference, we created the inner class. But right now, which object we are creating? Only outer object. So now you can see new outer. This is the outer object we are creating. With the help of this particular outer object, we are trying to call the inner constructor. Okay, so this is a way of creating this particular This is the way of creating this particular static nested class. Now you can see the two values are printing. The two values are printing here. Okay, this is important, we need to understand here. Okay, so any questions? Because we discussed about the non-static inner classes we discuss, and now we discuss about the static inner classes. So this is very important, we need to understand here. And whenever we are trying to use the static behavior, we are not going to use the non-static information. Okay, this is all about the static behavior we discuss here. So tomorrow we are going to discuss another important concept to call where arg length. So this is another important information we are going to discuss tomorrow. So once we familiar with this particular variable argument, and later we'll move on to the inheritance concepts here. Okay, so tomorrow one of the important concept we are going to discuss. So any questions or regarding about today's session? సాయి నీకు ఏమైనా క్వశ్చన్స్ ఉన్నాయా?
సార్ అవుటర్ మెథడ్స్, డిస్ప్లే మెథడ్స్, ఇంకా చాలా మెథడ్స్ ఉంటాయి కదా సార్, ఏదైనా యూజ్ చేసుకోవచ్చు కదా సార్?
సరే, నేను ఎగ్జాంపుల్ పర్పస్గా
ఇప్పుడు ఇన్నర్ మెథడ్ యూజ్ చేసుకుంటాను సార్, ఇట్లా ఈ సింటాక్స్ తోనే సేమ్ చేసుకుంటాను సార్.
నేమ్ ఆఫ్ ద మెథడ్ నువ్వేమన్నా మాడిఫై చేసుకో, అంటే ఇన్నర్ అనే రాసుకో, లేకపోతే నీ పేరు రాసుకో, లేకపోతే బేసిక్గా మెథడ్ ఎప్పుడైతే మనం డిక్లేర్ చేస్తామో పర్పస్, అంటే ఇప్పుడు ఎగ్జాంపుల్ ఈ డిస్ప్లే మెథడ్ అని ఉంది, ఈ మెథడ్ నేమ్ చూడడంతో నీకు ఒక ఐడియా రావాలి, ఈ మెథడ్ ఎందుకు రాశాను, ఇంటర్నల్గా ఈ మెథడ్ ఏం చేస్తుంది ఇక్కడ, అర్థమవుతుందా? సో ఇన్నర్ అని రాసుకుంటావు, ఇన్నర్ రాసుకున్నంత మాత్రాన నీకు ఒక ఐడియా రావాలి ఈ మెథడ్ ఏం చేస్తుంది ఇంటర్నల్గా. సో వాట్ ఈస్ ద పర్పస్ ఆఫ్ దిస్ మెథడ్ విల్ డూ, అర్థమవుతుందా? అందుకనే నేను డిస్ప్లే అని రాశాను. ఈ మెథడ్ ఎందుకు రాశానంటే అవుటర్ మెథడ్, ఒక ఐడియా రావు నీకు, ఈ మెథడ్ అవుటర్ క్లాస్లో డిఫైన్ చేస్తాం కాబట్టి ఇది ఒక అవుటర్ మెథడ్ అని నేను రాశాను ఇక్కడ. ఓకే, నువ్వు ఈ మెథడ్ నేమ్ ఏమన్నా రాసుకో, కాకపోతే ఏంటంటే సో రియల్ టైమ్ అప్లికేషన్ డెవలప్ చేసేటప్పుడు ఏదైతే మెథడ్ మనం డిఫైన్ చేస్తామో సో ఆ మెథడ్ చూడడంతో ఒక ఐడియా రావాలి, ఈ మెథడ్ ఎందుకు రాశాను, ఈ పర్పస్ ఏంది, ఆ మెథడ్ ఇంటర్నల్గా ఏమి యాక్టివిటీస్ చేస్తుంది. ఓకే, దాన్ని మైండ్లో పెట్టుకొని ఎప్పుడైతే మెథడ్ నేమ్ డిఫైన్ చేస్తావో ఆ మెథడ్ నేమ్ను కరెక్ట్గా డిఫైన్ చేయడం నేర్చుకోవాలి. ఓకే, సో నువ్వు చూస్తే ఇక్కడ బాక్స్ క్లాస్ వాల్యూమ్ అనే మెథడ్, ఇక్కడ నేనేం చేస్తున్నాను, మల్టిప్లై చేస్తున్నాను, మల్టిప్లై చేసిన తర్వాత ఈ ప్రింట్ చేస్తున్నాను. స్క్వేర్ మెథడ్, స్క్వేర్ అంటే ఏంటి, బేసిక్గా ఇక్కడ ఏదైతే ఇన్పుట్ ఇస్తున్నానో ఇక్కడ మనం మల్టిప్లై చేస్తున్నాం. సో వన్ ఇస్ లైక్ మ్యాథమెటికల్ సింపుల్ ఎగ్జామ్స్ ఉన్నాయి కదా, ద సింపుల్ టేబుల్ ఇన్ఫర్మేషన్, సో 1 multiply with 1 or 2 multiply with 2, సో స్క్వేర్ ఆపరేషన్స్. ఓకే, సో మ్యాథమెటిక్లో స్క్వేర్ ఎట్లా పనిచేస్తుందో ద సేమ్ బిహేవియర్ వి గివెన్ టు దిస్ పర్టికులర్ మెథడ్ కాల్ స్క్వేర్. అండ్ ఇక్కడ సెట్ వాల్యూస్, జస్ట్ వీఆర్ సెట్టింగ్ ద వాల్యూస్. ఓకే, ఓన్లీ ఇక్కడ సెట్ చేస్తున్నాం, సెట్టింగ్ తప్ప ఇక్కడ మనం ఏం ఆపరేషన్ చేయట్లేదు, అందుకని సెట్ వాల్యూస్ అని రాశాను ఇక్కడ, అర్థమవుతుందా? ఓకే, ఎప్పుడైతే మనం మెథడ్ని డిఫైన్ చేస్తున్నామో దానికి ఒక నేమింగ్ లైక్ ప్రాపర్ నేమ్ మనం ప్రొవైడ్ చేయాలి. సో దానికోసమే నేను ఇక్కడ డిస్ప్లే పెట్టుకున్నాను, దీనికోసం ఇక్కడ అవుటర్ మెథడ్ అని పెట్టుకున్నాను. ఓకే, సో ఎనీ నేమ్, కీవర్డ్స్ కాకుండా నువ్వు ఏమైనా నేమ్ పెట్టుకో, కాకపోతే పెట్టేటప్పుడు దానికి ఒక నేమింగ్ కన్వెన్షన్ ఉంటే ఈజీగా ఐడెంటిఫై చేయొచ్చు ఆ మెథడ్ ఏం చేస్తుంది ఇంటర్నల్గా. ఇంకా ఏమైనా క్వశ్చన్సా? Okay, so we'll continue tomorrow. Same time. So like morning is 8:30 to 9:30 and evening 8 to 9. Okay.